Princess Ada stood at the crystal window of her royal chamber, watching the 3 moons of Lumeria rise over the glowing horizon. The smallest moon cast a pale blue light across her face, highlighting the slight shimmer of her silvery skin. Like all Lumerians, her skin contained traces of living crystal, but hers lacked the vibrant patterns that mark those capable of producing hairs. The door chimed softly. "Enter," she said, knowing it would be yet another royal physician. These visits had become more frequent since her father, King Stone, had increased the pressure to solve her condition. Dr. Bright entered, his crystal-enhanced skin glowing with health and vitality. A stark contrast to Ada's dull shimmer. "Your Highness," he bowed, medical scanner already humming in his hands. "The latest treatment results are ready." Ada didn't turn around. "They're negative, aren't they?" Her voice was steady, practiced from years of receiving the same news. "I'm afraid so, Your Highness. Your genetic structure continues to resist modification. The crystal markers remain incompatible with reproduction." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "King Stone has requested a full report on all attempted treatments." Now Ada did turn, her eyes narrowing. "He means to make it public, doesn't he?" The physician's silence was answer enough. In Lumerian society, reproduction was more than a biological function. It was a carefully controlled process, managed through generations of genetic engineering. Their species had evolved alongside the living crystals of their world, developing a symbiotic relationship that enhanced their capabilities, but also made reproduction increasingly complex. Those deemed barren were rare and usually from the lower classes. Never in recorded history had a member of the royal family carried this flaw. Ada walked to her desk, running her fingers over the ancient crystal formations that served as both decoration and computer terminal. The surface lit up at her touch, displaying the latest news. Another successful birth among the nobility, another celebration of genetic perfection that she could never achieve. "Leave the report," she said. "I'll review it before my father makes his announcement." After Dr. Bright left, Ada activated her private communications terminal. Messages from various noble houses filled the screen, each containing barely veiled questions about her condition. The latest was from Lord Reed, whose son had once been considered a potential match for her. The message was polite but clear. They were withdrawing their interest in any alliance. A knock on her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. This time it was her personal guard, Ray. "Princess, the king requests your presence in the Grand Hall." Ada straightened her formal robes, ensuring the crystal ornaments were properly aligned. These small details mattered in the royal court, where every imperfection was noted and discussed. She followed Ray through the winding crystal corridors of the palace, their footsteps echoing off the living walls that pulsed with soft light. The Grand Hall was empty except for King Stone, who stood before the ancestral crystal, a massive formation that recorded the genetic history of their royal line. His skin blazed with patterns of authority and power, making Ada's plain appearance even more conspicuous. "The physicians have confirmed it again," he said without turning. "Your genetic structure cannot support an heir." "Father, there might be other ways." "Other ways?" He turned sharply. "Our entire civilization is built on genetic purity and controlled evolution. The royal line has maintained perfect crystal resonance for 10,000 years. And now," he gestured at her dull skin, "my only hair cannot even maintain basic reproductive compatibility." Ada felt the familiar shame burning in her chest, but kept her voice level. "The ancient records speak of a time before we controlled our genetics so strictly. Perhaps if we look to other methods." "Enough." King Stone's skin flared brightly with anger. "I have called an emergency session of the Royal Council. We will discuss options for alternative succession." As Ada watched her father stride away, she knew what this meant. They would try to remove her from the line of succession, to hide away the imperfect princess who threatened their carefully constructed genetic hierarchy. But for the first time, she felt something beyond shame and acceptance, a small spark of defiance. Unknown to both Ada and her father, A message was already making its way through space toward their world. Earth had finally achieved faster-than-light travel, and their first diplomatic mission was headed to Lumeria. Among the human delegation was a young diplomat named Tom, whose arrival would challenge everything the Lumerians thought they knew about genetics, evolution, and the nature of life itself. The human ship broke through Lumeria's atmosphere like a falling star, its hull gleaming under the triple moonlight. Tom stood at the viewport, amazed by the sight below. The entire capital city seemed to be made of crystal, with buildings that grew naturally from the ground and reached toward the sky like perfectly formed gems. "Remember the protocols," Captain West said behind him. "The Lumerians are extremely formal. One wrong move could ruin Earth's first diplomatic mission." Tom nodded, but his attention was fixed on the royal palace ahead, a massive structure that pulsed with its own inner light. As Earth's leading xenobiologist and diplomat, he had studied everything available about Lumerian culture, yet nothing had prepared him for the reality of their world. The landing pad extended from the palace like a crystal flower opening its petals. As Tom and the other diplomats walked down their ship's ramp, he noticed how their normal human skin looked dull compared to the shimmering Lumerian welcoming party. King Stone stood at the front, his skin patterns shifting with regal authority. "Welcome to Lumeria," he said through their universal translator. "We are curious about your species. You've achieved much despite your biological simplicity." Tom caught the slight insult but smiled anyway. "Thank you for your generous welcome, Your Majesty. We look forward to learning from each other." That's when he first saw her, Princess Ada, standing slightly behind her father. Unlike the other Lumerians whose skin blazed with light, her shimmer was subtle, almost human-like. Their eyes met briefly, and Tom saw something unexpected in her gaze, curiosity mixed with loneliness. The formal reception moved into the grand hall, where crystal tables held exotic foods and drinks. Tom found himself naturally gravitating toward the princess, who stood alone near a window. "Your world is beautiful," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "I've never seen anything like it." Ada turned, seeming surprised that someone had approached her voluntarily. "You find beauty in our crystals despite not having any yourself." "Different doesn't mean inferior," Tom replied. "Every species evolves in unique ways. That's what makes the universe fascinating." A slight glow appeared on Ada's cheeks, the Lumerian equivalent of a blush. "Most here would disagree. They believe our crystal evolution makes us superior." "And what do you believe, Your Highness?" Before she could answer, King Stone's voice boomed across the hall. "Princess Ada, Lord Spark wishes to discuss something with you." Tom watched as Ada walked away, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. He didn't miss the disapproving look the king shot in his direction. Later that evening, Tom was studying some crystal formations in the palace garden when he heard soft footsteps behind him. It was Ada. "You're the first person who's asked what I believe," she said quietly, "not what I should believe." Tom turned to face her. "I noticed you see things differently than your father. The crystal gave us much," Ada gestured at the garden, "but it also trapped us. We're so focused on genetic purity that we've stopped evolving." She paused, then added in an even lower voice, "Some of us can't even reproduce anymore." The pain in her voice was clear. Tom wanted to comfort her, but knew touching royalty was forbidden. Instead, he said, "Sometimes what seems like a flaw is actually an adaptation waiting to be understood." Ada's eyes widened slightly. Before she could respond, a royal guard appeared. "Princess, your father requests your presence." As Ada left, she glanced back at Tom. Something had changed in that brief conversation. A connection had formed that would soon shake the foundations of Lumerian society. In his quarters that night, Tom reviewed his genetic research notes. There was something unusual about Ada's crystal patterns, something that didn't match any of the documented Lumerian norms. As a xenobiologist, his curiosity was piqued. As a diplomat, he knew he should stay away. But as a human, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he'd met someone special. someone who could change everything. A crisis erupted 3 weeks after the humans' arrival. The trading ships from the outer colonies were reporting strange disturbances in their crystal drive engines. Without a solution, Lumeria's economy would collapse within months. King Stone called an emergency meeting. Tom sat at the far end of the crystal table, watching Ada across from him. She looked tired. The royal physicians had increased their treatments since his arrival. The crystal drives are failing because of mineral decay, Lord Spark announced. We need new mining routes. Through Earth's sector of space, King Stone added, looking at Tom. Your people must grant us access. Tom knew this was coming. Earth is willing to help, he said carefully, but we need to understand the technology first. Our scientists could work with yours. Share our crystal science with primitives. Lord Spark's skin flashed with anger. Impossible. Father, Ada spoke up, her voice clear and steady. What if we show them only the basic principles? Enough to help, but not enough to. You. Lord Spark laughed. A barren princess who can't even maintain proper crystal resonance. The room fell silent. Ada's skin dimmed even further, but she didn't look away. I've studied the ancient records. Before we relied so heavily on crystal technology, we worked with other species. We were stronger for it. To everyone's surprise, King Stone nodded slowly. The crisis gives us no choice. Princess Ada and Ambassador Tom will lead a joint research team. But he fixed Tom with a hard stare. Nothing about crystal genetics will be shared. Over the next few weeks, Tom and Ada spent long hours in the palace's research chamber. They made progress with the crystal drives, but Tom found himself more interested in Ada's unique crystal patterns. Your structure isn't flawed, he told her one evening as they worked alone. It's different in a way I've never seen before. Ada looked up from her crystal terminal. Different is dangerous here. Or maybe it's exactly what your people need. Tom moved closer, showing her his research tablet. Look, your crystal integration isn't weaker, it's more adaptable. Like human DNA. Their hands brushed as she took the tablet. Both froze at the contact. The crystal walls around them pulsed with a strange new pattern. The crystals, Ada whispered. They're responding to us. Tom checked his scanner. Your crystal patterns. They're synchronizing with my bioelectric field. That should be impossible. They were standing very close now. Ada's skin began to glow with a warm light Tom had never seen in any Lumerian. All my life, she said softly. They said I was wrong. Broken. But with you. The door chimed suddenly. They jumped apart as Dr. Bright entered. Your Highness, your father wishes to know if... He stopped, staring at his medical scanner. Princess, your crystal resonance. It's changing. After that, they tried to stay professional. But during the royal festival 3 days later, when the crystal city blazed with light and music, they found themselves alone in the palace gardens. The mining routes are almost ready, Tom said. Earth's council will approve them tomorrow. Then you'll leave. Ada's voice was barely a whisper. I don't want to. The crystal flowers around them began to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. Ada stepped closer. The old records speak of a time when we let our hearts guide us, not just our genetics. Tom knew he should step back. This could ruin everything. The trade deal, Earth's first alien alliance, his career. But when Ada reached for his hand, her skin glowing like starlight, he didn't pull away. The kiss was gentle, uncertain. Then the crystal garden exploded with light, bathing them in colors no one had seen in 10,000 years of Lumerian history. Neither of them noticed the security camera quietly recording everything, its feed going directly to King Stone's private terminal. Later, in the darkness of her chamber, Ada would realize her skin was glowing brighter than ever before, and deep in her changing biology, something impossible was about to begin. Ada knew something was different the morning the crystal walls in her chamber began responding to her emotions. Her skin glowed with new patterns, soft, swirling colors that no Lumerian had ever shown before. At first, she thought it was happiness. 2 weeks had passed since the festival night with Tom. The trade routes were working well, and her father had even praised her role in saving their economy. Then the morning sickness started. "Impossible," Dr. Bright muttered, running his scanner over her for the 5th time. "Your genetics are still incompatible with reproduction." And yet, Ada watched the medical hologram floating above her bed. Inside her body, crystal patterns were shifting, changing, making room for something new. Something that glowed with both crystal light and human warmth. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, touching the hologram with trembling fingers. Dr. Bright's skin paled to a sickly gray. "The genetic markers. They're not purely Lumerian. Princess, what have you done?" Ada stood up, her royal training taking over. "You will speak of this to no one. Not even my father. Doctor-patient confidentiality still exists, even for royalty. But Your Highness, this is unprecedented. A hybrid child. It could kill you. The crystal integration is adapting," she finished. "Look at the patterns. They're not fighting the human DNA. They're dancing with it." The doctor stared at his readings. It was true. Instead of rejecting the foreign genetics, Ada's crystals were creating new patterns, beautiful spirals of light that protected and nourished the growing life within her. Ada needed to tell Tom, but he was off-world, presenting their crystal drive findings to Earth's council. By the time he returned, she wouldn't be able to hide it anymore. The next few days were agony. Her skin's glow grew stronger, forcing her to stay in her chambers. She claimed illness, which wasn't entirely a lie. The morning sickness was worse than any Lumerian pregnancy she'd read about. A week later, Tom returned. She asked him to meet her in the secure research chamber, away from prying eyes. "Ada," he smiled as he entered, then stopped short. "Your patterns, they're incredible." She took a deep breath. "Tom, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt like years. Tom's face went through a range of emotions: shock, fear, wonder, and finally, joy. "But they said you couldn't." He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "Apparently, human genetics don't play by Lumerian rules." She placed his hand on her stomach, where the new patterns swirled brightest. "A hybrid child," he whispered. "The first in history. Ada, this changes everything we know about cross-species genetics." She pulled away. "It also breaks about 50 royal laws. My father will be furious. The noble houses will demand my removal from succession. They might even—" "I won't let them hurt you," Tom said firmly. "Either of you. Earth will grant you asylum if—" "No." Ada straightened her shoulders. "I am still the Princess of Lumeria. This child is not just our miracle. It could be exactly what our people need. A way to break free from genetic stagnation." Before Tom could respond, a priority alert flashed on the room's crystal displays. King Stone was demanding all royal family members and human diplomats attend an emergency session. "He knows." Ada's skin dimmed with fear. "Someone must have noticed the pattern changes." Tom took her hand again. "Then we face it together. Your people believe in genetic destiny, right? Well, maybe this is exactly what destiny had in mind." As they walked toward the grand hall, Ada felt the child's presence more strongly than ever. Half human, half Lumerian. Somehow perfectly balanced between two species that everyone thought could never mix. In a few minutes, their secret would change two worlds forever. But for now, in the quiet of the crystal corridor, Ada smiled. Her supposedly barren body had created something entirely new in the universe, and no matter what happened next, that was a kind of magic even her father's rage couldn't destroy. The grand hall crackled with tension. King Stone stood before the ancestral crystal, his skin blazing with such intense patterns that several court members had to look away. The noble houses lined the walls, their combined crystal resonance making the air itself shimmer. When Ada and Tom entered, a wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Her new patterns were clearly visible now, impossible to hide. "So it's true," King Stone's voice was deadly quiet. "Come closer, daughter." Ada walked forward, head held high. Tom tried to follow, but guards blocked his path with crystal spears. The medical scans don't lie. King Stone activated a giant hologram in the center of the hall. Ada's pregnancy scan floated for all to see, the hybrid patterns clearly visible. "My daughter, the Princess of Lumeria, carries a mongrel child." "Father," Ada started. Silence. The king's shout made the crystal walls vibrate. "Do you understand what you've done? 10,000 years of pure crystal lineage, destroyed by human contamination." Tom struggled against the guards. "Your Majesty, if you just look at the data." The human dares to speak. Lord Spark stepped forward, his skin pulsing with disgust. "This is an act of biological warfare. They sent him to corrupt our royal line." "No." Ada's voice rang out strong and clear. "I chose this. I chose him. And this child is not corruption. It's evolution." The crowd gasped. King Stone moved so fast his robes crackled with energy. He grabbed Ada's arm, studying her patterns with growing horror. "The human genetics. They're not just mixing with the crystal matrix. They're enhancing it." He turned to Dr. Bright. "Explain this abomination." The doctor trembled but stood his ground. "Sire, the scans show something remarkable. The human DNA isn't fighting the crystal integration like we expected. Instead, it's improving it. The child's patterns are stronger than anything in our genetic records." "Impossible." Lord Spark checked the readings himself. "This defies all our laws of genetic purity." "Perhaps our laws were wrong." Ada gently pulled free from her father's grip. "Look at the patterns, Father. Really look. This child carries the strength of both worlds." For a moment, something flickered in King Stone's eyes, a hint of wonder as he watched the swirling patterns beneath his daughter's skin. Then his face hardened. "Take the human to the detention crystals," he ordered. "He will be tried for genetic contamination of the royal line." "No." Ada's patterns flared so brightly that everyone stepped back. The ancestral crystal behind them began to pulse in rhythm with her emotions. "If you imprison him, you imprison me too. This child is both human and Lumerian, just like our future must be." "Guards." King Stone raised his hand. But before anyone could move, the ancestral crystal did something it hadn't done in thousands of years. It changed color, shifting from its royal blue to a new pattern that matched Ada's perfectly. The noble houses murmured in shock. The ancestral crystal was said to respond only to the purest royal genetics. Yet here it was, acknowledging a hybrid child as part of the royal line. King Stone stared at the crystal, then at his daughter. For the first time in his life, he looked uncertain. "Lock them both in the royal chambers," he finally said. "Post guards. No one enters or leaves until the Council of Elders can be summoned." As they were led away, Tom managed to catch Ada's hand. Her skin was still glowing with those impossible new patterns, beautiful and defiant. "The ancestral crystal recognized our child," she whispered. "Even if my father won't, our ancient ancestors just did." Behind them, the crystal continued to pulse with its new colors, casting strange shadows through the grand hall. And in the medical wing, Dr. Bright stared at new test results that would soon shake the foundations of Lumerian society even further. Dr. Bright stood before the Council of Elders, his hand shaking as he held the latest test results. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the Grand Hall. 3 days of intense study of Ada's changing biology. "Speak, Doctor," the head elder's voice echoed through the crystal chamber. "What have you discovered?" Behind him, King Stone sat on his throne, eyes dark with barely contained anger. The other council members leaned forward, their crystal patterns dimmed with anxiety. "The human DNA in Princess Ada's child isn't just compatible with our crystal matrix," Dr. Bright began, activating the holographic display. "It's rewriting our understanding of genetic potential." The display showed a complex dance of DNA strands and crystal patterns. Human genetics are naturally adaptable. far more than we ever imagined. Instead of breaking down our crystal structures, they're creating new, stronger patterns. Impossible, one elder muttered, but others were leaning closer, fascinated by the swirling display. Our own records show our fertility rates have dropped 60% in the last 1,000 years, Dr. Bright continued. Our obsession with genetic purity has led to stagnation. But look at this. He switched to a live feed from Ada's medical monitors. The hybrid child's patterns pulsed with vibrant health, stronger than any pure Lumerian pregnancy in recorded history. The human genetic adaptability is unlocking portions of our crystal matrix we thought were dead ends. This could solve our fertility crisis, not just for the royal family, but for all Lumerians. King Stone stood abruptly. You suggest we should all mix with humans, destroy 10,000 years of careful genetic engineering. Not destroy, Your Majesty, evolve. Dr. Bright's voice grew stronger. I've run simulations using Princess Ada's medical data. Within 3 generations, controlled human Lumerian breeding could restore our fertility rates to ancient levels. Our children would be stronger, their crystal integration more stable. The council chamber erupted in argument. Some elders were outraged, others intrigued. But all fell silent when a new figure appeared at the chamber doors. Ada walked in, her pregnant form now unmistakable. Her skin patterns had grown even more beautiful, combining Lumerian crystal symmetry with organic, human-like swirls. The ancient records speak truth, she said clearly. Before we became obsessed with genetic purity, we were a species that embraced change. The crystals chose us because we could adapt, grow, become more than we were. She placed her hand on her stomach, where the child's patterns glowed in response. This baby isn't just my child. It's proof that we've been wrong about genetic purity, wrong about humans, wrong about our own potential. Dr. Bright nodded eagerly. The princess is correct. Look at these cellular scans. The human DNA isn't corrupting our crystal matrix. It's healing it, advancing it. The child's genetic structure is more stable than anything we've seen in centuries. One by one, the elders activated their own scientific displays, reviewing the data. Even the most conservative couldn't deny the numbers. The hybrid child's readings were extraordinary. There's more, Dr. Bright added quietly. I've detected similar compatibility markers in other Lumerians, especially those we labeled as flawed or barren. They're not broken. They're ready for the next step in our evolution. They just needed the right catalyst. King Stone stared at his daughter, at the miracle growing within her. For the first time, scientific truth was challenging his deepest beliefs. If what you say is true, he said slowly, then everything we've believed about genetic purity was based on incomplete data. Dr. Bright finished. The humans aren't primitive, Your Majesty. Their genetic adaptability is exactly what our species needs to survive. Ada stepped forward, her patterns brightening. Father, we don't have to choose between tradition and progress. We can honor our past while embracing a new future. My child proves it's possible. The council chamber fell silent, the weight of history heavy in the air. Everything they'd believed about genetics, about humans, about their own species, was about to change. And it all started because a barren princess and a human dared to love against all odds. The day Ada went into labor, the Crystal City's lights pulsed in colors never seen before. The news had spread across Lumeria. Their princess was about to give birth to the first human Lumerian child in history. Tom paced outside the medical chamber, watched carefully by both royal guards and Earth diplomats. Inside, Ada's patterns lit up the room with each contraction. The crystal matrix is stable, Dr. Bright announced, monitoring the swirling patterns. The child is strong. King Stone stood by the window, watching the crowds gathering below. The past month had seen massive changes in Lumerian society. After the scientific revelations, other flawed Lumerians had come forward, their unique patterns suddenly seen as valuable rather than shameful. Father, Ada called out, her voice tired but firm. "Come meet your grandchild." The king turned slowly. In the medical bed, Ada held a tiny figure that glowed with impossible beauty. The baby's skin shimmered with perfect crystal patterns, but they moved and shifted like waves on water, organic and fluid in a way pure Lumerian patterns never were. "A girl," Dr. Bright said softly. "And her readings. They're off the charts." Tom was finally allowed to enter. He rushed to Ada's side, tears in his eyes as he saw his daughter for the first time. "She's perfect." The baby opened her eyes. They held both the crystal shine of Lumeria and the warm depths of Earth. When she smiled, the entire medical wing's crystal matrix hummed in response. "The ancestral crystal was right," Ada said, looking at her father. "This child isn't the end of our line. She's a new beginning." King Stone stepped closer, studying his granddaughter's patterns. They were stronger than any he'd seen in his long life, pulsing with both crystal power and human vitality. "The Council of Elders has reached a decision," he said finally. "Based on Dr. Bright's research and the evidence before us, we are opening diplomatic channels for more human Lumerian cooperation." Tom looked up in surprise. "You mean?" "Limited breeding rights will be granted to compatible pairs," the king continued. "Under medical supervision, of course. And the laws regarding genetic flaws will be rewritten. We can no longer ignore the evidence that diversity makes us stronger." Ada's patterns brightened with joy. The baby cooed, her tiny hands reaching up with perfect crystal human coordination. "She needs a name," Tom said softly. Ada smiled. "In the ancient records, there was a time when we named children after natural phenomena, before we became so focused on crystal purity." "Dawn," King Stone said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Because she represents the dawn of a new era. For both our peoples." The baby's patterns sparkled at the name, as if in approval. Outside, the crowds cheered as the news of her birth spread through the Crystal City's communication matrix. 1 month later, the Grand Hall was filled again, but this time for a celebration. Dawn was being officially presented to both Lumerian and Earth diplomats. Her unique beauty had already inspired changes throughout society. The first wave of human Lumerian couples had begun genetic compatibility testing, and early results were promising. "To think," Ada whispered to Tom as they watched their daughter charm both species with her impossible patterns. "All this started because I was supposed to be Barren." "You weren't barren," he replied. "You were just waiting for the right evolution." King Stone, watching his granddaughter generate new crystal patterns no one had ever seen before, finally understood. His species had spent so long trying to perfect their genetics that they'd forgotten the most important lesson of life itself. True strength comes from growth, change, and the courage to become something new. As Dawn grew up, she would become a bridge between two worlds, living proof that the future belongs not to those who maintain their purity, but to those who dare to adapt and evolve. The human-Lumerian alliance would go on to achieve things neither species could have managed alone, all because a flawed princess and a primitive human proved that love could rewrite the laws of genetics itself.